I want to welcome all of you to Emmanuel Lutheran Church for the Western Montana Spiritual Development Council, and especially thank Emmanuel Lutheran for offering this beautiful sanctuary at no cost so that we could hold this event and enjoy this evening. So we're very grateful to them. I want to say that this event is being filmed by the Missoula Community Access Television through their grants to community nonprofits. And if you have any questions, you should call MCAT at 542-6228. It will be shown on MCAT within about a month, 3 weeks, and we'll try to let you all know when it will be shown. We'll also hope to have some tapes available so that you can borrow it for your youth groups or classes. The mission of the Western Montana Spiritual Development Council is to bring programs like this to Missoula and wonderful nationally known speakers on spiritual and religious affairs so that we get the benefit of meeting and hearing them in person and not just reading their books. We waited for almost 9 months for Jim Wallace, but I want to point out we've waited over a year for Michael Dowd. So that just tells you the importance that we ascribe to having him finally come back to Missoula, especially because we think it's important to find the common ground between science and religion. And very few people are really speaking to that. A lot of people are speaking against it, and as we see it, not really representing our faith communities or our faith very accurately. And so we really want to welcome Michael. He'll be explaining both his ideas and also telling you about all the wonderful things in the back of the sanctuary that you can get your hands on afterwards. So, Michael, welcome to Missoula.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm curious, have any of you heard my wife, Connie Barlow, speak or myself speak before? Okay, there's just a few of you. Great. Fabulous. Well, this is exciting. My name is Michael Dowd, and my wife, Connie Barlow, and I have lived for the last 6 years permanently traveling North America. And we don't have a home, we don't have a storage bin. I mean, we live permanently out of the generosity of people who open up their homes to us. And what we do is we teach and preach a sacred, meaningful experience of the whole universe story. In fact, the phrase that we talk about, that we use is the great story. And what we mean by the great story is the epic of 14 billion years of cosmos, earth, life, and human history as one meaningful story, as one sacred myth, in the way that Joseph Campbell used the term. Not as an untrue story, but as a narrative that puts us in accord with the universe. That's that which helps us feel our connection to the whole. Now, I'm actually not going to use this for, in fact, let me go ahead and turn this off because otherwise I can't compete with Hubble. No way. I'm not going to be using the PowerPoint for probably at least another hour. But what I'd like to do is give you a little more background on me and Connie and what we do. And then I'd like to hear what your questions are related to science and religion, related to evolution and theology, or evolution and spirituality, or related to sustainability, because these are our passions. And because we've got about 10 hours of really cool, interesting stuff that we can deliver, and rather than me give you what I think you might be interested in for the next hour and a half or 2 hours or so, I'd rather be responsive to what your interests genuinely are. And so let me give you a little more background. I used to be an anti-evolutionary fundamentalist. I actively opposed people who taught evolution, and I had a small stack of tracts and would argue with anybody who thought the world was more than 6,000 years old. So clearly, however you understand ultimate reality, clearly that's a sense of humor, because now I travel all over North America with my non-theistic wife popularizing a sacred, meaningful, inspiring way of thinking about evolution. So, in fact, did you see the side of the van where we've got the Jesus and Darwin fish kissing with hearts between them? We just spent a month in Texas, and we got some interesting looks down in Texas. Occasionally some interesting gestures. In fact, we pulled into Lawrence, Kansas, and this biology professor looked at the side of the van, and he goes, "Oh, great, you just piss everybody off." But what we try to offer is a way of thinking about what our best science is giving us, but thinking about it in a sacred way. Thinking about it in a way that can touch, move, and inspire us to be of service to the world, to add our creative energies toward co-creating a just, healthy, beautiful, and sustainably life-giving future for humanity and as many other species as possible. because that, we think, is the great work of our time. I mean, that's why Connie and I, for the last 6 years, have lived on the road, is that we're committed to doing everything that we can in our lifetime to help ensure a thriving future for planet Earth and as many other species as possible. We think that's the great work of our time. I mean, you could say every age has its great work to do. It's kind of the collective calling of that time and place. Our way of describing the great work of our time is, as I said, ensuring a just, healthy, beautiful, and sustainably life-giving future for the planet and humanity and other species as well. Because if we don't do that work in another 100 years or so, there may not be any work to be done. And this sacred evolutionary perspective is an understanding that allows us to cooperate across ethnic and religious differences, not by blurring the differences, but by actually celebrating our differences, but doing so in an evolutionary context. 50 years from now, there will still be Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and Jews and Hindus and all the different religious traditions. And yet within the next 50 years, most of them will have integrated, deeply integrated, an evolutionary ecological worldview. And so there'll be evolutionary Christians, evolutionary Hindus, evolutionary Muslims, evolutionary Buddhists. And evolutionary forms of each religious tradition find it easy to cooperate and to celebrate our differences, because it's not merely about believing in otherworldly supernatural things. It's all about what we all know through our experience, through our felt experience. It's a common shared experience because it's not just about believing, it's also about what we know through our experiences. And this is what science and religion are spurring each other to greatness. Science and religion are mutually enhancing, or at least they can be. But for many people in our culture, there's this polarized debate. On the one hand, you've got your new atheists, you know, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, the new atheists. And then on the other side, you've got your young earth creationists and intelligent design people. And in fact, the two are not the same. They're usually lumped together, unfortunately. They're not the same, but still, intelligent design and young earth creationism is nothing like what I'm going to be sharing tonight. But most people, including the media, think that that's the game in town. And yet what I'll be sharing tonight is a way of understanding evolution that's as grounded in anything that's being said over here. In fact, Richard Dawkins let me print a letter in my book that he wrote to his 10-year-old daughter. And so this perspective has not only been endorsed by 5 Nobel Prize winners, all these other scientists, but also people across religious and ethnic differences, because it validates our differences. It says those differences are a good thing, but there's a way to understand them that can inspire us to work together. So back to the background piece. So after I was an anti-evolutionary fundamentalist, I ended up actually embracing evolution at an evangelical college. It was Assemblies of God College, Springfield, Missouri. Evangel University. It's affiliated with the Assemblies of God. And what happened was I met a Buddhist Christian. And I didn't know what it was to even be a Buddhist Christian. I mean, in my world, he was going to hell because he was so liberal. Yet he was the most Christ-like person I'd ever met. I'd never met anybody more generous, more thoughtful, more compassionate, more amazing. So my head said, get him saved, but my heart said, ask him to mentor you. And my world expanded as a result of that. I ended up pastoring 3 United Church of Christ congregations over the course of a decade. And then I was asked to be involved in environmental sustainability work. My job for the next 6 years was basically in environmental community organizing. And that was my ministry. My job for 1 year was to organize Jewish rabbis, Catholic priests, Protestant clergy, evangelical clergy, and Unitarian Universalist clergy on key environmental issues that were coming up for a vote in Congress. I did that for a year, and then for 5 years after that, I headed up the first government-funded sustainable lifestyle campaign in the United States. 3 years in Portland, Oregon, and 2 years for the state of New York. My job was to help neighbors come together and support each other for 4 to 6 months in using less water, driving less, composting, recycling, all the different aspects of living a more earth-based, sustainability ethic, and building trust and a sense of community with their neighbors in the process. And then I met my wife, Connie Barlow. Now, Connie has been a science writer for the last 20 years. Her passion is the nexus, the intersection of science and meaning, science and inspiration. So we fell in love as mission partners. I asked her to marry me 7 years ago. We got married about 6 months later, and we've been on the road, ever since, basically. Just after we got married, we hit the road. So for 6 years, this is the way we live. So with that as background, I'd love to hear what your questions are related to the questions that you came here with that you'd love to hear addressed before we leave tonight. The questions related to science and religion, or evolution and theology, evolution, spirituality, or sustainability? And I'm not going to answer each question. I just want to hear what the questions are, and that'll allow me to have a sense of where to go this evening. And since we're being filmed, I'll repeat the question, but please speak up anyway. Yes?
My question concerns my understanding of evolutionary theory, in that it's just totally random, that the notion of a creator is inconsistent with scientific understandings of evolutionary theory.
Yeah, the way you said it is precisely that that way of thinking about it is what perpetuates the kind of polarized thing. And what I'll be offering, you may or may not find it inspiring for you, but what I'll be offering is a way of bringing that together. Yeah. Yes?
What will be the key ingredients in the transition of seeing these Christians and Muslims and all starting to embrace this evolutionary?
Yeah. What are the mileposts, or what are the things? What are the key pieces that will, kind of move us in the direction? Because I'm making some pretty bold claims. I'm saying that within 50 years, people of all different religious traditions will not just tolerate, but will enthusiastically embrace an evolutionary ecological worldview. That's a pretty amazing claim. Is that just a pipe dream? How do I see that unfolding? I'll share that. Yes. Did you have a question in the back?
I do. I'm trying to put it so it makes sense. Assuming that there is a God, does man have the power to destroy creation?
Yeah. Good question. Okay. Could you please raise this mic some? Thanks. Others? Yeah. Yeah, if there is evolution, is there life elsewhere in the cosmos? And the question before related to if there is a God. Say the second piece.
Does man have the capacity?
Oh, do we have the capacity? Do human beings have the capacity to destroy creation, destroy the planet? Yeah. Yes?
How do you reconcile evolution with Genesis?
How do I reconcile evolution with Genesis? Great question. Okay, I'm going to jump in and start because I'm not going to be able to hold all these in my head a whole lot longer. But feel free in another half hour or so, if I haven't addressed this, raise it again. But there's a couple of things, a couple of core concepts that I want to introduce that I think will begin to at least give you a sense of where Connie and I are coming from and why so many people from different traditions are finding this to be a bridge-building perspective. First, since several of the questions related to God or, what I call ultimate reality or the creator or evolution. So let me point a couple of things at the start. First of all, there's a distinction that we make between private and public revelation. Private revelation is an insight that comes through the psyche of one individual who then has to communicate that insight to others, and others may or may not believe it. Moses goes to the top of the mountain. Well, something happens. He tells other people about it. And the Apostle Paul is on the road to Damascus, blinding flash of light, revelation. He tells other people about it. Or an insight comes to you and you tell someone about it. Private revelation, by its very nature, produces religious believers or unbelievers. In fact, it can only produce religious believers or unbelievers. Public revelation, because if I have an insight and I tell you about it, you might believe me, you might not. Public revelation is what's being revealed about the nature of reality. What's so? What's fundamentally the case about the nature of reality, the knowledge of which is not merely coming through the psyche of one individual. I mean, it's sometimes introduced that way. Einstein has a vision of riding a beam of light. But then he publishes a paper, and the whole scientific community goes to work trying to disprove it. The skeptical scientific method is all about discerning, is this true or is this simply something that's said to be true because some charismatic or authoritative person said it was true, or because it's been passed down for so many generations that it must be true? Or is it measurably true? Is it empirically true? Is it true in a way that people of all different religious traditions and no religious tradition can agree that it's true? And we call that public revelation. It's what the scientific enterprise is all about. It's reality revealing itself to the human through our understandings and through our tests for trying to discern whether this is in fact true or not. The whole scientific method is really an exercise in collective intelligence. Our species, as a whole, is becoming more collectively intelligent. We are more intelligent as a species today than we were 200 years ago or 500 years ago or 5,000 years ago. And public revelation can make religious knowers out of religious believers. That is, it can take what we thought were beliefs and realize that these things are symbolic. These things are pointing to something fundamentally true about the nature of reality. But they're doing so given day and night language. So that's the second distinction that I want to talk about. The distinction between private and public revelation, but also the distinction between day and night language. Now, what I mean by day language is day language reflects our day experience. Okay? We all have a daytime experience and we all have a nighttime experience, and the two are not the same. Right? We do things at night that we would never do or could never do during the day. We fly. We turn into other creatures. We walk through walls. We have conversations with animals. We have all kinds of really interesting things that if those same things were to happen to us during the day, we'd call them either supernatural, miraculous, or bizarre, right? But we don't think of them as supernatural or miraculous because that's our dream reality, and we know what that's like. I mean, when you're in the middle of a dream, and if you're talking to another animal, you don't think anything is strange about it. It's only if you judge it by day standards that it becomes strange or bizarre. Now, as human beings evolved and lived in different parts of the world, they would have reflected on different plants, different animals, different terrain, and different climate. I mean, people living in a harsh desert climate are living in a very different world than people living in a lush tropical climate. In fact, we don't even know about each other's world. And so our experience of the world is different. Our experience of reality is different. And the metaphors that we use to describe the nature of the reality in which we live and move and have our being, that is, the reality that is ultimate for us, is going to be experienced differently in different cultures. And we would use a different blend of day and night language to describe that experience. See, all cultures have a story or set of stories that explain the fundamental questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where's everything going? And why are we special as a people? All cultures have these. There's not a single culture anywhere in the world that doesn't have a cosmology or a creation myth or a creation story. And there's not a single one of them that I know that doesn't use a blend of day and night language. I mean, we all have experiences, like, for example, a talking snake tempting in a garden, right? That's an experience that any of us could have at night. But if you were to leave here and go to your car and a snake started talking to you, you'd probably have the thought, okay, who slipped me the LSD? We don't tend to have experiences of talking snakes during the daytime. But that doesn't mean it's not true. It means it's symbolic of something else, in the same way that dreams, when interpreted, can be profoundly transformative or informative. And so it's not a surprise that we find people living in different cultures, different parts of the world, reflecting on a different experience. And of course, our words, as symbolic language emerged, right? Our words are based on our experience. And the stringing together of words into stories that explain these big questions are going to be different. So for example, let's say we over here on this side of the room had never experienced sheep. Well, the Lamb of God wouldn't be a part of our tradition. Right? If we over here had never experienced the political reality of a king, the kingdom of God would be a completely foreign concept. We'd tell stories of lotus blossoms or whatever was a part of our experience. So all religions make sense given the different bioregions and cultures in which they emerge. This doesn't mean, of course, they make sense if you interpret their core doctrines as true in a day language way. But if you interpret their core doctrines as true in a night language way, that is saying something true about the nature of reality and our relationship to it, using the particular metaphors of their experience, they all make sense. And if I were to say what was the single most significant in terms of its cultural impact, the single most significant of the public revelation, that is the most significant religious insight that science has given us, I would say that it's the nested, emergent nature of divine creativity. The nested, like nesting dolls, you've seen Russian nesting dolls, like dolls within dolls, right? Subatomic particles within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms, within planets, within galaxies. It goes all the way up and all the way down. Every level can create. That's what I mean by divine creativity. That is the power, the ability to bring something new into existence that never existed before. I mean, it's a classic attribute of the divine, right? Whatever we mean by God or any other divine name, the goddess or Allah or any other divine name, we're at least meaning the creator. That power, that force that created everything. And what we now know, not believe, we know this is something 98% of the scientists of the world would agree with, is that whatever it was that brought everything into existence didn't merely exist at the beginning of time and make everything the way a potter makes a pot or a carpenter makes a table. That divine creativity exists throughout the entire universe in a nested sense and in an emergent sense. That is, things weren't made once and for all at one time and they're just kind of basically that way now. No, the universe as a whole has gone from simple atoms. First, it was just energy that emerged out of no-thingness, nothingness, which we could say is God or the all-nourishing abyss or the implicate order or the pregnant void. All different kinds of theologians and scientists have tried in language to point to that fundamental realm of no-thingness out of which everything emerges. Okay? There's never going to be one way to talk about that. But out of that emerges this great energy, and we call it the Big Bang. And as the universe cooled and became more complex, the universe began to first create atoms. First, it was just hydrogen, simplest atom. And then more complex atoms, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. And then more complex atoms, and then molecules, and then more complex molecules, and creatures, and more complex creatures, and societies, and more complex societies. And this is one unfolding process. It's an emerging process that we emerge out of. We are part of the process. Human beings are not separate from the universe. We are literally the universe, after some 14 billion years of unbroken evolution, now becoming conscious of itself. We didn't come into the world. We grew out of it. In the same way that apples grow out of an apple tree. We're organically related to this whole natural process. We are nature uncovering its own nature. A human being looking through a telescope is literally the universe looking at itself and going, whoa. A biology student looking through a microscope is the planet Earth learning with awareness, with consciousness, how it's functioned unconsciously and instinctually for billions of years. Brian Swimme is a physicist, a cosmologist. I love this quote. He says, 4 billion years ago, the Earth was molten rock, and now it sings opera. Right? Earth was once molten rock, now it sings opera. And nobody put anything here. When the Bible, like Genesis 2:7, you asked before about how I relate this to Genesis. When the Genesis 2:7 speaks of God forming us from the dust of the ground and breathing into us the breath of life, that's a true story. It's a traditionally sacred way, a night language way of describing the fact that we grew out of the dynamics of the planet itself, and it's a divine creative reality of the whole, in this case personified God, the largest nesting doll, personified as the divine, as God, that makes that possible. I mean, how could Moses have said it any other way? Here's another quote from Brian Swimme. Now, I think you like this, but I don't know. It's audacious. He tries to take the entire history of the universe, the 14 billion year history of the universe, and sum it up in 2 sentences. He says, you take a great cloud of hydrogen gas and you just leave it alone. And it becomes rose bushes, giraffes, and human beings. We don't believe this. We know this. This is something 97, 98% of the scientists of the world would agree with. This is considered factual knowledge. Now, we can talk about this in day language, like I just did, or we can talk about this in night language. That how did God create the very atoms of our bodies? How did God create humans? Both are legitimate ways of talking about it. In fact, I don't know what happened to the lights, or if it's possible to have lights on these, or maybe not. Maybe these are too far forward. Does anybody know anything about the lights? Okay. Yeah, turn on as many lights as possible. There we go. Okay, that's better. Thank you. Great, fabulous. I want to say something about just some of these images here because it will give you a sense of the kind of revelation, revealing. Actually, let me say one more thing about God before I even get to this. Because the question before was, well, if God is real, then can we destroy ourselves? Evolution theology offers a way of thinking about the divine that is beyond belief or disbelief. It's like, could you imagine somebody coming up to you and saying, do you believe in water? No, come on, really, do you believe in water? Right? Guess what? It doesn't matter whether we believe in water or not. We're 50 to 70% water. We couldn't exist without water, right? It doesn't matter whether you believe in life. Could you imagine somebody saying, do you believe in life? Hey, let's have an argument. Do you believe in life or not? Right? It doesn't matter whether we believe in life or not. We're an expression of life. We're part of life. Now, what we say about life, hey, that's believable or not. Somebody can say, life is so kind and wonderful. Somebody else says, life sucks, it's terrible. Well, that's believable or not, depending upon your experience. But the fact of life just is. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you believe in the largest nesting doll or not. We're part of it. We're an expression of it. That ultimate creative reality that includes all other realities, yet transcends all other realities. In other words, the only reality, the only creativity that's not a subset of some larger, more comprehensive creativity, more comprehensive reality. Now, the challenge with the nesting doll analogy is you'd have to imagine the largest nesting doll being infinite in all directions to try to get some sense of what I'm pointing to. But again, this is beyond belief or disbelief. It's like we don't believe in reality. Or let's put it this way, it doesn't matter whether you believe in reality or not. Reality is something that every plant, every animal, and every human being cannot not experience, inwardly and outwardly. One of my favorite quotes from Philip K. Dick, he's a science fiction writer. He says, reality is that which when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And that's what I'm pointing to. Nothing less real, undeniably real than that is what I'm pointing to when I use the word God. So I would never say I believe in God. I would say I know the whole of reality and I choose to call that reality God. There is such a thing as the wholeness of reality that is more than the sum of the parts. In the same way that a molecule of water is more than the sum of the hydrogen and oxygen that make it up. You are more than the sum of the chemical elements that make you up. There's this emergent moreness. In fact, let me say a little bit more about this. I'm realizing I'm going down a track that's tying some things together, but I didn't know I was going to go there, but I really want to. 10,000 years ago, now we need to be humble about what we think was happening 10,000 years ago, but our best evidence suggests, most scientists, most anthropologists and archaeologists would agree that 10,000 years ago, to the best that we know, most cultures had feminine images for what ultimate reality was like. The great goddess, the earth mother, right? And it made sense because out of women we could see our species continued, and we could see this out of the female, all other species, right? So whatever gave birth to everything must be like a woman. Well, about 5,000 years ago, two technologies came into being that began shifting the metaphors from feminine to masculine. One of them was the plow. Plows take male upper body strength, and men begin to step in and become the primary food providers. Roughly at the same time that writing develops, and writing promotes a sequential, linear, abstract, one could even say patriarchal way of thinking. In fact, there's a best-selling book, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, back about 5 years ago, called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, written by Leonard Schlein. He's a brain surgeon in California who talked about, among other things, how when writing and the plow come into a culture, usually in less than 1,000 years, very quickly, the major metaphors shift from feminine to masculine, meaning the goddesses are replaced by the gods. Now reality is described as father, lord, king, warrior, these strong dominant male images. And it's not a surprise that we find ultimate reality, God, being referred to as king, not long after we find the first kings in human existence. It's like, duh. Well, about 500 years ago, we see a new technology come into being. See, we almost always use our technologies as the basis of our metaphors. Today, you hear, for example, people talking about how the human brain is like a computer, right? Well, we couldn't talk that way if we didn't have computers. Right? And so what happened was clocks were invented, and clocks about 500 years ago became a compelling analogy. Now reality as a whole was not mother or father. Those are quaint. Reality is like a complex clock. And the more that we break it down into its component parts, we then think we understand the whole. In the way that we do clocks. I mean, if you take that clock on the back wall apart and you understand all the parts and how they function together, you understand the whole of it. The whole of that clock is nothing but the sum of its parts. The whole of this piano is nothing but the sum of its parts. However, as I said before, the whole of a molecule of water or the whole of you and me is more than the sum of the parts that make us up. However, if you imagine the universe, nature, as like a complex clock, where's the only place that ultimate creativity can possibly exist with respect to a clockwork universe? Yeah, outside of it. Why? Because whoever made that clock is outside of it. Whoever made this computer is outside of it. Whoever made this piano is outside of it. So if you imagine nature as a complex clock, God, or ultimate creativity, can only be outside of it. So we see the trivializing of God. God had been understood in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Jewish Christians and Muslim tradition. God was always immanent and omnipresent. That is, there was no place that God, whatever else we mean by God, we're pointing to something that doesn't stop here and something else begin here. Those God was immanent and omnipresent. But in a mechanistic universe, that is, when you think nature is like a complex clock, we lose the immanence and the omnipresence of the divine. So God becomes an idea. Do you believe in this supreme landlord who resides off the planet and outside the universe or not? Do you believe in the supreme engineer that made this clockwork universe or not? And the big debate, does God intervene in his creation? Or does he not? Or does he even exist? All of those presuppose a trivial God. And if I was going to argue in a court of law, if I was going to like put evidence down, if I was going to try to make my case that God has become trivialized in the West, the first witness that I would call onto the stand would be Richard Dawkins. Now, Richard and my wife have known each other for years. They're close friends. Richard, as I said, let me use some of his material in my book. But I would call him as a witness. And the reason I would is because this, is that Richard Dawkins, one of the world's best scientists, best known scientists, could write a best-selling book called The God Delusion. Now, would anybody ever write a book called The Life Delusion? The Universe Delusion, right? No, because life and the universe are not trivial concepts. They're undeniably real. Yet God is no longer understood as undeniably real. God's an idea. It's a being up there, out there. And what evolution theology, what this perspective that Connie and I are offering, is not that vision of God. You may or may not choose to use divine names to describe the nature of ultimate reality. You don't have to. You see, hear many New Age people today talk about the universe. The universe is conspiring on my behalf, right? They're using the phrase the universe in the way that people a few hundred years ago would have said God. Or people 10,000 years ago would have said the goddess. In other words, we are a subset of the whole. We can't get outside the whole to examine it. So we have to use analogies and metaphors to describe the nature of ultimacy or the nature of the whole. And there's never going to be one right way to do it. What this means, among other things, is that we can stop fighting and killing each other over our respective analogies and metaphors for the whole or for ultimacy, which I realize may be preaching to the choir here, but this, I suspect, is news to many of your neighbors. Let me now talk about some of these Hubble space shots. In fact, let me say one last thing on this God notion. Any God that can be believed in or not believed in is precisely what I'm not talking about. When I use the word God or the goddess, right, or Allah, if what you think of is something that can be believed or someone that can be believed or not, that's not what I'm talking about. In fact, I was preaching at my last church, was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I had this young man, he was probably 20, 21 years old. He kind of strutted up to me. I was, standing by the back door, shaking people's hands on their way out. He kind of struts up to me. He says, "Well, Reverend," I'm an atheist. So I grabbed his hand and I said, "Well, praise God, brother, so am I." And I held on to his hand until he had this sort of confused look. I said, "So tell me about this God you don't believe in, because I'm sure I don't believe in that God either." By definition, atheism, you're an atheist, that means you're not a theist. And whenever anybody says to me straight out they're an atheist, the first thing I ask them is, what's a theist mean to you? Like, what do you think of as a theist? Because chances are, by their own definition, I too am an atheist. I don't believe in that kind of a God. In fact, sometimes conservatives will sometimes ask me, usually around this point in my program, in a somewhat frustrated tone, and I'm not even talking conservative Christians, conservatives of other traditions as well, will ask me and say, well, what are you anyway? Like, are you a theist, or are you an atheist, or are you a pantheist? I can't tell what you are. I had to coin my own term. I say, I'm a creatheist, and my wife Connie, she's a creatheist. Now, we spell it the same way, we mean the same thing by it, we just pronounce it differently. I'm a creatheist, and she's a creatheist. And it's not a belief system. You don't have to believe anything to be a creatheist or a creatheist. It's what we know through the sciences. It's not about believing. It's what basically most of the scientists of the world would agree with. And there's three main components. The first is that the whole of reality is creative in a nested, emergent sense. The second is that we're part of the process. We are the universe. We are creation becoming conscious of itself. And the third is that because we're a subset of the whole and can't get outside the whole to examine it, we have to use analogies and metaphors. And there will never be one right way to talk about the nature of ultimate reality or the nature of the whole. And these three together are what we call creatheism or creatheism. All right, now finally I'm going to get to the photos here. Anybody know the name of this top image? Yes, it is a spiral galaxy, and it's specifically the closest spiral galaxy to the Milky Way. It's kind of like what the Milky Way would look like. If we could get outside the Milky Way and look back, it's basically what the Milky Way would look like. But it's actually our closest neighbor galaxy. It's called Andromeda Galaxy, M31. It's Andromeda Galaxy, and if you didn't know that this was Andromeda Galaxy, you really should get to know your neighbors. This is our closest neighbor, right? It's 2 million light years away. That is, we're seeing this not as it is now, but as it was 2 million years ago, because it's taken light traveling 11 million miles a minute, 2 million years to reach our eyes. And this is our closest neighbor. Now, this bottom image is called the Hubble Deep Field photo. They took the Hubble Space Telescope and focused on a little itty-witty, just a teeny patch of sky. In fact, none of the ground-based telescopes on Earth could see anything. It was a completely black section of space. And in fact, it was so small, if you took an 8-foot-long straw, okay, you know, like you drink a milkshake out of that's 8 feet long and you look through it? That's how much little bit of sky the Hubble focused on for 10 days, taking pictures, sometimes keeping the lenses open for 40 minutes to capture photons from the deepest regions. And this is what showed up. Now this here, where my finger is, this is a star in the Milky Way galaxy. But every other dot, no matter how large, no matter how small, are all galaxies, like Andromeda. But some of these are 9 billion or 10 billion light years away. That is, we're seeing them not as they are now, but as they were 9 or 10 billion years ago, when the universe was quite young. The universe is said to be 13.7. We rounded off to 14 billion years old. Now, I say 2 million light years away. Some of these are 10 billion light years away. Somebody tell me, what's the difference between millions, billions, trillions, and zillions? Yeah, a bunch of zeros. I mean, and the fact that zillions isn't a real number, right? We can't get our heads around these kinds of numbers. They're literally astronomical. Our brains did not evolve to pay attention because, frankly, these kinds of numbers never had anything to do with our survival, so we don't know we can't get our heads around them. I'm going to offer a way for you to think about millions and billions, and I promise you, if you're like me, you will never think about millions and billions quite in the same way again. Check this out. 1 million seconds is 12 days. Okay, 1 million seconds, 12 days. 1 billion seconds is 31 years. Did you get that? The difference between 12 days and 31 years is the difference between 1 million and 1 billion. Trust me on this one, folks. Billionaires are not the same species as millionaires. And did you know that now as a nation we're $9 trillion in debt? Let's not go there, right? This is a galaxy that's 65 million light years away. Okay? This galaxy is, we're seeing the light that left this galaxy when the dinosaurs died out. Just amazing. This is death in the heavens. See, for 99% of human history, we didn't know that there was death and birth in the heavens. We thought that the heavens were perfection, immortal, the realm of the gods. Nothing ever changed up there. Here on earth was where we found pain and suffering and decay, and these things needed to be explained. But now we know if it weren't for the death of stars like these are both red giants that are in their dying phase are creating carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. And we don't believe that that's what they're doing. We know that. We can measure how much carbon, how much nitrogen, how much oxygen. In fact, to breathe, take a deep breath. To breathe is to literally commune with red giant stars, because we breathe in and out nitrogen, we breathe in oxygen, and we breathe out carbon dioxide. Every breath is literally a communion with red giant stars. that lived and died before our sun was born. This one here, this top one, it's the Helix Nebula, but it's unofficially called the Eye of God at NASA. Doesn't it look like an eye? I'm trying to aim it so that the glare doesn't get in your eyes there. But the folks at Nike say if this is the eye of God, they've got proof God wears Nikes. It's two galaxies that are actually in a dance. Now this picture here, this is a picture of birth in the heavens. In fact, Connie did a program at a Unitarian Universalist church a couple of years ago where a little 8-year-old girl comes up and says, "Is this the Eagle Nebula?" Now it is, right? And Connie said, "Yeah, it is actually." And she said, "See this section here? Baby stars are being born." Is that amazing? And and it's true. This is a stellar nursery. Stars are coming into being that never existed before. Now, I don't know if this is an RE director or a parent, but with this kid, somebody was definitely doing their job, right? But birth and death exist in the heavens, and we've only known this since 1957, the year before I was born. So let me stop and take questions before I start using the PowerPoint here, because I want to get into something really juicy. I want to get into where this program or where this perspective can change people's lives, and where young people especially find it like, whoa, it opens up some stuff. And that's in our brain, how this perspective, what it tells us about our brains and how our brains evolve and our psychology. And what this also does is it realizes, that is, it makes real some of the night language concepts like the fall and original sin. See, the fall is a concept common to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Original sin is a concept only for Christianity. It was invented by St. Augustine in the 4th century, and the Jews and the Muslims don't use the language of original sin. But both of them are pointing to the same fundamental dynamic, which is we all have an unchosen nature. We all have inherited proclivities. We have aspects of ourselves that we didn't choose, we just find ourselves this way. And so I want to talk about that. But before I do, any questions on what I've covered so far? Yes?
One question I have, I read that some like Native Americans have creation stories that are similar, like they might have a flood. You know, if you look, they're similar, like either mythology or creation stories.
Yeah, well, when you imagine, the question is there are many tribes, many peoples around the world that have some similarities in their creation stories. For example, one of them that's common, it may not be necessarily the creation of the world, but a lot of cultures have stories of floods, the great floods, massive floods. Well, you all here, I mean, like, I'm assuming that most of you, if not all of you, know about the great Missoula floods, Lake Missoula, right? I mean, we didn't know this until in the 1920s. J. Harlan Bretz, a geologist, was trying to explain these really weird geological features in eastern Washington. And the only way he could explain, like these huge boulders, gargantuan boulders that were sitting in the middle of fields. Like, how did that happen, right? These huge gullies, these incredible, like 200 feet tall rolling hills, that it wasn't until the 1960s with aerial photography that we could see, oh my God, these are ripple marks, giant ripple marks. And then now we've known, and there's not a geologist in the world that would debate this, is that at least 17 times here in this area, right? 17 times the glaciers went south. Every time the glaciers, in the last 2.5 million years, every time the glaciers came south, 17 times, right? And all the plants and animals would boogie south, right? And then when the glaciers would go back, they'd all come back. Well, every time the glaciers came south here, they would block the Clark Fork River. And what would happen was the whole valley would fill up. In fact, it was larger, more water than in any of the Great Lakes right now. And when it reached its height of 2,000 feet, it would break the ice dam, and within 48 hours, all of this water would rush to the Pacific Ocean. Now, these kinds of things happen in other parts of the world as well. And so it's not a surprise that some of these creation stories are actually, or some of the stories of the flood, are in fact likely pointing to something that actually has been told by stories over the generations. And again, every culture could be counted on to use a blend of day and night language to talk about that. So the story of Noah's Ark is pointing to something that's a way of communicating this basic understanding, but using the night language. And you don't have to interpret that literally to experience it meaningfully. Yeah.
Well, first, just the frustration of having all of our topsoil washed away all those times. What about the concept of the soul that's greater than the sum of our parts?
Yeah.
And is it temporal, eternal?
Yeah. Well, my short answer would be there is a whole realm of what we need to stand either in the place of humility or the place of not knowing or the place of agnosticism, if you want to use that word. That is, there's a whole realm of the inner non-measurable aspect of human experience that we use words to describe, such as the soul, that we can't definitively say in scientific measurable terms what that's like. For example, what happens on the other side of death. In fact, let me, as soon as I turn the PowerPoint on, I'll give you an example of the first time that I ever thought about this that touches exactly on what you're talking about in terms of soul and life after death and stuff like that. Okay, well, I'm going to get started on that then. So now, whatever light is shining on, I don't know which lights to turn off. Yeah, that's probably good enough. Everything else can probably stay the same, because this will brighten up quite a bit here in just a second. Oh, you know what? This actually reminds me. Connie and I have two websites. One of them is called thankgodforevolution.com, and the other one is called thegreatstory.org. And these websites, we put out an email newsletter about once every month to 3 months. All the new stuff, because this website, thegreatstory.org, we get like almost 500,000 hits a month on that website. It's just an educational tool. And so we try to make people aware of all the cool stuff that's happening in this movement. So about once to every 1 to 3 months, we send out an email. And I'm going to send out a couple clipboards. And if you want to be on this list, just put your name and email address down. And I promise you two things. One is you will never get more than 1 email a month. And you can easily get off the list anytime, and we don't give your email address out to anybody. As I said, this is Andromeda Galaxy. This is the Hubble Deep Field photo. Yeah, that's okay. So Albert Einstein, let me tell you, the first time that I ever thought about day and night language, I was ordained in 1990, and I took the United Church of Christ Statement of Faith, and I had been pastoring for 2.5 years, but I took the United Church of Christ Statement of Faith, we believe in God, blah, 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 and I chunked it out one sentence at a time, and I interpreted it from this sacred evolutionary perspective. And those of you that are either athletes or artists, when you're just like at the top of your game, like you're just on, right? I was in the flow. I was just on. My paper went well, really well. I was fielding questions. The evening was going great. And this gentleman stood up. He was towards the back of the room. He stood up and he said, Michael, he said, I've been coming to these ordination hearings, he said, for 38 years. And to be honest with you, I can't remember when I've come to one that I was more like, whoa. However, he said, and there was a certain, way that he said, however, that I knew I was in trouble. He said, there's a little boy that lives in me. And my little boy wants to ask you the kind of questions that little boys might want to ask about religion, things like life after death, soul, stuff like that. He says, in fact, what my little boy wants to ask you is, where do you suppose your mentor is? Emery Wallace, now that he's died. See, I had been guided for 2.5 years through the ordination process by an 84-year-old retired minister who had studied with Matthew Fox and Thomas Berry. He was totally into the sacred evolutionary perspective, and he died 3 weeks before my ordination hearing. And I fell in love with this man. I mean, I'd been working with him for 2.5 years. And virtually everybody in this room knew and loved Emery Wallace. And this guy stands up and says, the little boy in me wants to know, where's he now? Like, what's your evolutionary theology to say about that? I had two thoughts immediately race through my mind. One of them was, damn, this evening had gone so well. The second one was, boy, this is your ordination hearing. You better speak. And I didn't even know what I was going to say. I just opened my mouth and I just started speaking. And what I said was this. I said, the only way to answer the question, where is Emery now that he's died, is to first use day language, normal everyday discourse, and then the other is night language, the language of our dreams, of poetry, of myth, of symbol. And the interesting thing is, as mammals, we must dream or we will die. Did you know that? If you keep a human person or a dog or a cat or a wolf or a bear or an elephant, not that I would try to keep a wolf or a bear or an elephant from dreaming, right? But we'll die. And yet we dream in a whole different reality. As I said before, we do things in our dreams that we would never do or could never do during the day. So I said, here, let me answer this question, but let me first use day language, and then I'll use night language. First, the day language side. Emery's body is being decomposed by bacteria. Ultimately, all that'll be left is his teeth and his bones. His genes continue to live on in his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. His impact, his influence, lives on in those he's touched and influenced, those they've touched and influenced, those they've touched and influenced, and so on. That's the day language side. But if I stop there, I haven't told you the truth. I've told you half the truth. In order to address this whole inner, non-measurable aspect of human existence, I've got to use some kind of night language, some kind of mythic or poetic or inspiring language. Now, it doesn't have to be otherworldly. Many of us in this room probably find non-otherworldly night language more inspiring, but traditionally it has been. And so I said, here, let me try. I said, Emery is at the right hand of God the Father, worshiping and giving glory with all the saints. Or I could say Emery's being held and nurtured by God the Mother. Or I could say Emery's being, to use a Tibetan symbol system, that Emery has entered the Bardo realm. In other words, there's no one right symbol system. There's no one right mythic or poetic or religious or metaphorical way of speaking about the inner non-measurable aspect of human existence. But unless we use some kind of language in this realm, we're not going to address what most people need to find meaning. Why? Because facts just sit there. Uninterpreted facts don't inspire. They just sit there. They have to be interpreted to be inspiring, and there's never only one right way to interpret any set of facts. Albert Einstein weighed in on this. Now, he didn't use day and night language, but he said if you interpret the ascension of Jesus literally, all right? You know the ascension of Jesus, the story in the first chapter of the book of Acts? You've got Jesus in his resurrected form, whatever exactly that means, is talking to his disciples, and they're saying, is now the time for the kingdom to come? And he says, it's not for you to know. These things are set by the Father, and you get the sense, like if ABC News, right, or CNN was covering this for the nightly news, you get the sense that Jesus in his robes just starts flying up, starts taking off, right? And just a few hundred miles up on the other side of the dome of the heavens, he's back with God. Because that was the worldview of that day. Space only went up a few hundred miles. Time only went back a few thousand years. In fact, if you were Luke, who is said to be the author of the book of Acts, if you were Luke and you wanted to communicate that Jesus returned to the source, he returned to the Father, the way that he told that story was a completely acceptable and legitimate way in that culture to tell that story. But Einstein said, this is the universe we live in. This is 2 million light years away. Some of these galaxies are 9 or 10 billion light years away. Einstein said if you interpret the ascension of Jesus literally in the universe that we today live in, he said if Jesus flew at the speed of light, he not only wouldn't be outside the universe yet, he wouldn't be outside the Milky Way galaxy yet. And when I speak to, I just spoke at an evangelical church last week. I was with 125 evangelical ministers in the Bahamas back 4 months ago. Now, when I speak to evangelical audiences, I say, now, I don't know about you, but seeing my Lord in orbit doesn't do anything for my spiritual sensibilities. The thought that I could look through a telescope and see the risen Christ up there is not inspiring to me. So we got to realize we're talking night language here. Have any of you seen this image yet? This is one of my favorite images of all time. This is an uncolored, touched-up photo from the Cassini mission. There's no color touch-up here at all. This is a solar eclipse. The sun is directly behind Saturn. See a little piece of the sun right there? And that little dot right there, you can hardly see it, is planet Earth. Check it out, right there. Do you see it? Can you see that little dot right there? That's planet Earth. Talk about a perspective shift, huh? Here's a telephoto a lens from Mars. This is planet Earth. This is the moon. Every transformation of humanity has rested upon deep stirrings of the intuition, whose rationalized expression amounts to a new vision of the cosmos and the nature of the human. I love this picture too. This is great. I want to now step into talking about evolutionary psychology, evolutionary brain science, evolutionary ethics and morality, and human universals. And here's where we see the realizing of some core concepts, core doctrines from the Judeo-Christian and Islamic world. We now understand through evolutionary brain science, functional MRIs, we can see the human brain working, while people are thinking, while people are talking, while people are contemplating, while people are meditating. We can see which part of the brains are being used. And it's given us some profound understandings of the nature of the human mind and how the brain evolved. We have very little evidence, for example, of an all-knowing, supreme, intelligent designer outside the universe that designed the perfect human brain for human beings to thrive in the world. We have tremendous evidence that our brain evolved in an additive sort of way. There's the reptilian brain, the old mammalian brain, the new mammalian brain, and the most advanced form. This is the brain stem and the cerebellum here. This is the part of our brain that, you know, when you fall and you catch yourself and you think, man, that was good. I didn't even have to think about that, right? It happens quicker than thought, right? It's instinctual. And that's what's going on in this part of the brain. In fact, you could say it's the part of your brain that knows how to breathe, that knows how to get hungry, that knows how to get horny. It's the part of our brain that's concerned with the basics of survival and reproduction. In fact, you could say that the only thing this part of the brain really cares about are the 3 S's: safety, sustenance, and sex. And prior to puberty, usually just safety and sustenance. Or you could say that what this part of the brain's really all about is the 5 F's: fight, flight, freeze, food, and copulate. Come on, I'm in a church. This part of the brain, the limbic system, this is the hippocampus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus. This is the part of our brain that's all about emotions and relationships. It's all about what we now need as social mammals to thrive in a social world. And it's all about bonding, kinship, play, status, reciprocity. If I'm nice to you, you're naturally going to want to be nice to me. If I'm nasty to you, you're naturally going to want to be nasty to me. It's difficult not to. That's what's going on in this part of the brain. Now, the new mammalian brain is the neocortex. This is the part of our brain that 2 new drives come into being with the neocortex: the drive to comprehend and the drive to predict. Now, comprehend and predict for what? Like, why would evolution produce an organ that was really good at comprehending and predicting? Well, so that these parts of the brain can get what they want more effectively. It's why we are masters of self-deception. We are gifted at rationalizing. And this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobes, this is the part of our brain that's the executive center. It's good judgment or poor judgment. In fact, we typically have poor judgment before this part of the brain is fully evolved. And guess what? Guess what? Insurance companies have known and parents have known that science is now just finally catching up with. That young people don't have a fully formed prefrontal cortex until about the age of 25. It's why we humans, why we adults need to help be the external prefrontal cortex for our young people. In fact, there was a woman that came to one of our programs a few months ago who's a guidance counselor. And the Supreme Court, just 3 years ago, ruled that no state could put to death anyone who committed a crime under the age of 18. And the reason that they cited was because this part of the brain did not develop until 23 to 25. And so this woman, this guidance counselor, cut this article out of the newspaper. This was in Texas, okay? Cut the article out of the newspaper, posted it on her refrigerator. And she told us the story that one Saturday night, her 14-year-old daughter came up to her and said, "Mom, I know my curfew is at 10:30, but there's this really important, really great party that's happening tonight. This is a Saturday night. Can I please stay out till 1 o'clock?" And the mother just walked into the refrigerator and pointed at the, at the article. And the girl apparently rolled her eyes and says, why has my mother got to be a guidance counselor, right? Now, Connie, my wife, is always trying to find fun, playful ways of having this stuff be memorable for young people and kids. So here's what we've done with this. So we've got our lizard legacy, right? Our fur little mammal, our monkey mind, and our higher porpoise. So let me say a little bit about these. Again, our lizard legacy is the part of our brain that's concerned mostly with sex, safety, sustenance, survival issues, right? The basics of survival. This part of the brain, the fur little mammal, is all about nurturing, bonding, kinship, play, status. Very important to mammals. But also, notice there's a darker side and a lighter side. It's not all just warm fuzzies. Because what's also going on in this part of the brain is in-group, out-group mentality. We cooperate and care for our kind of people. We can hate them, right? And most cultures have these. Most cultures have sacred stories that tell us why we're supposed to cooperate, but why it's okay to demonize them. And of course, we got sacred stories doing the same thing. In fact, the Ten Commandments. Okay, now I'm not picking on the Jews or the Hebrews. Please hear this. This is true of virtually all cultures. But I'm just using this as an example because most of us are familiar with this story. The Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill. Commandment number 6. Now, who did that apply to? Other Hebrews, right? It was okay to wipe out the Philistines. 20 million Canaanites, destroy them all, thus saith the Lord. Now, again, I'm not picking on the Hebrews or the Jews. Please hear this. Most cultures have the same thing going on. And that's what's going on in this part of the brain. Now, actually, let me come back here. The monkey mind this comes out of Buddhism. It's the monkey goes from branch to branch, eats a little fruit, eats a little fruit. It's kind of like our thoughts, our rational, verbal part of the brain. We're rarely in the present moment. We're thinking about the past. We're worried about the future. We're fantasizing. We're fearing. We're just, our mind is everywhere else other than right here, right now. That's why our meditation practices are all about coming into the present moment. This is the whole thing with Oprah right now with the Eckhart Tolle. And then our higher purpose is obviously our higher purpose. It's the sense of goals, projects, commitments. See, we will naturally, this is what we will do instinctually, is follow these drives. It takes commitment to follow your purpose or mission or some, God's will or some project, marriage vows or whatever. This is where all of this is at root. Now, let me say, here's where this becomes really potentially life-changing. These parts of the brain are largely unconscious. That is, you don't have to think about this stuff. It'll happen automatically. In fact, one of the books that we sometimes sell is a book that I highly recommend called The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, Jonathan Haidt. And it's called The Happiness Hypothesis. And he likens these two parts of the brain to an elephant. And this part of the brain he likens to a rider on the elephant. Now, imagine, okay, think about a big elephant and a little human rider on top of the elephant with reins, right? Now, the rider thinks it's in control. But the rider is only, in fact, in control if the elephant doesn't have strong desires of its own. Like, let's say the elephant wants to go in this direction because there's an elephant of the opposite sex in that direction, or because there's food and water in that direction, right? The rider will always say, in fact, the rider can't not interpret. What the monkey mind will always do, it will always interpret. It can't not do that. In fact, even if you say something's meaningless, you're making it mean nothing. We are meaning-making animals. So let's say the elephant wants to go this direction for whatever reason. The rider will always say something like this. We're going this way because, but the because may have nothing to do with why the elephant's going that way. And this is, there's so much documented evidence of this. This is not something we believe. We know that this is the relationship of this part of the brain to the other parts of the brain. See, these are our unchosen nature. It's our inherited proclivities. It's what Christians and Muslims or Jews are pointing to when they talk about the fall, or what Christians are pointing to when they talk about original sin. Imagine you lived 2,000 years ago. You wouldn't understand any of this stuff, but what you would understand is that we all do things like this. We all say, we'll never do that again, but we do it. You can count on me for that, but we don't. We betray each other's trust. We say, I'm committed to this, but we never do it. Like, what's the deal? Well, it's because we have an unchosen nature that we have instincts. Okay, here's the thing. We have instincts that evolved in a very different world than the world that we today live in. For example, who of us in this room chooses to be attracted to foods that have sugars, salts, and fats? Nobody! You don't have to choose it. You find yourself attracted to foods that have sugar, salts, and fats. Why? Because for 99% of human history, it wasn't easy to find sugar, salts, and fats. So having a craving for these things allowed our ancestors to survive long enough to reproduce. Yet today, it's very easy to find sugar, salts, and fats. Yet we still have these cravings. It's our unchosen nature. Did you know that every one of us is alive in this room because some of our ancestors were really, really good at holding on to and storing fat for the lean, for the droughts, for the harsh winters. And we now carry their genes. So some of the things that we find challenging about ourselves, we can also be grateful for because we wouldn't be here without those things. Did you know that there's a scientifically proven correlation between the amount of testosterone in the human organism and how much that organism takes risks and how much that organism tends to think about sex? There's a friend of mine, a woman down in Southern California. She told me, she said, she was on a hormonal therapy. She had to wear testosterone patches. She told me, she said, I can't stop thinking about sex. Is this what guys have to deal with? Well, the answer is yes. And it's not just guys. Women also have testosterone, and some women have lots more than others. But men typically have 10 to 100 times the testosterone that women do. And the amazing thing is, in fact, I was reading just online the other day, if you just put in testosterone levels, status, like in Google, you'll get all kinds of really cool stuff. One of the things I was reading about was this woman that basically had no sex drive ever for like 10 years, and all of a sudden she was on testosterone. They put her on testosterone, and she said she was walking down the street and she was mentally undressing everybody. This is bizarre. That's what testosterone does, is that kind of stuff. But here's the interesting thing about status. Men and women have a certain base level of testosterone. But then if there's a rise in status where people are now looking up to you where they weren't looking up to you before, your testosterone, and this is true of all humans and all primates, your testosterone levels will not only rise, but in many cases will shoot up. So let's say you got a great relationship with your spouse or your partner, okay, right? There's no temptation. It's easy for you to be in integrity, to honor your commitments, right? And then you get promoted at work. Or you become a minister, or you become a therapist, or you become the manager of your store. Or let's say you get voted into office. And I'm not even talking about President of the United States or Governor of New York, right? I'm talking about your school board, right? If there's a rise in status, your testosterone levels will rise, in many cases rise significantly. Now, if you're caught unprepared for this, okay, let's say you got a great relationship with your spouse, and then you get promoted at work, and all of a sudden you got sex on the brain, right? You don't know what's going on because you don't understand this stuff. You're going to interpret it somehow. You have to interpret it somehow. So let's say you interpret it as though maybe something's wrong with your relationship to your spouse. After all, why would you be fantasizing about this other person or dreaming about this other person? Or if you interpret this as maybe you're really a spiritual type, and maybe you interpret this as it's God's will that you connect with Sarah Jane over here. Or if you interpret this as though you're simply fundamentally evil or sinful or flawed, or if you're a Christian and you interpret the reason you're having these immoral thoughts is because your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother ate an apple because she was tempted by a snake in a garden, you're not going to know how to stay in impeccable integrity. You're not going to have the self-knowledge or the tools to how to stay in integrity. And because you're embarrassed about it, you're probably not going to tell anybody, which makes it all the more likely that you're going to fall or you're going to break your commitments. I'll tell you a true story. Just a few months ago, there was a gentleman came up to me after one of my sermons. I sometimes speak on this on Sunday mornings. I don't, or usually, but I was asked to do this at this church. And this gentleman came up to me. He was probably 70 years old, be my guess. And he came up to me after the church service. He says, Michael, I got to tell you something. I've never told another living being this. Well, he had my attention. He said, in 1973, I think he said, I became the vice president of my corporation. He said, I had now all this responsibility. He said, I was completely unprepared for what would happen with my libido. Within 6 months of my promotion, now I had been faithful to my wife up to this point. Within 6 months of my promotion, he said, I had 5 affairs. None of them knew about each other. My wife didn't know about any of them. It ultimately cost me my marriage. It cost me my job. And I've been living with the guilt and the shame of this for 35 years. He said, not only did your sermon help me understand what was going on, but he feels like he said, like I can let go of the self-judgment and recrimination, and now I can start cleaning up the messes. And he did. Between Sunday morning and Tuesday night, which is when I did the follow-up workshop, he called his ex-wife. He started calling these other women and started apologizing for being such a deceptive, lying sack. And he came into integrity. And guess what? His depression of the last, I think he said 12 or 15 years lifted. This perspective it makes it, I'll speak for me personally, it makes it so much easier for me to stay, and I'm just talking about testosterone now. We could talk about a lot of other things, but it makes it easier to be in integrity. See, you wouldn't catch, in fact, let me move on to this next slide. Oh, this is actually a picture of a friend of mine's daughter in a zoo. There's a plate glass between these two, but look at this. Is that extraordinary? This is a story of how somebody had an awakening through this evolutionary psychology. Parable of the pickle jar. This is my wife's niece, Halsey Barlow. Halsey grew up in a very conservative Catholic family. Her mother and father listened to Rush Limbaugh every day. Her mother's completely anti-evolution, or at least she was. And Halsey goes to nursing school, and she has her first semester in nursing school, she takes an ecology class, and her ecology professor is a fanatic about evolution. Okay, it wasn't even an evolution class. And he has them do a paper, and she has to write a paper on Madagascan lemurs, right, which is what these are. Then she went to a zoo, right? Well, at any rate, she had this conversion to evolution. She totally got evolution. And then she read Robert Wright's award-winning book called The Moral Animal, Why We Are the Way That We Are, the New Science of Evolutionary Psychology. And she sent us this parable. We call it the parable. It was just an email. She said, I now put everything into an evolutionary context. It's almost become a reaction that when I encounter a situation, I think, okay, why am I feeling this way? How and why would my 780th great-grandmother react to this? It doesn't even have to be anything significant. For instance, if I see one of my roommates snacking on my jar of pickles, I get this feeling in my stomach like, hey, back off, those are mine, mine, mine. I want to be laid back and not care, but my instincts are so darn uptight. But knowing that I'm a selfish, status-seeking hornball only motivates me to do things that say, F you to my evolutionary roots, even though I really love them. I absolutely love how imperfect and clumsy we are as humans. I mean, almost any situation can be laughed off if we only step back and take a look at why we feel the way that we do. I love it. I wouldn't want it any other way. Now, is that amazing as an 18-year-old to have that level of witness capacity? Let me tell you about how a young person, a first grader. See, we've got these puppets. We've got like this lizard legacy puppet, all these different puppets, and we teach teachers to teach kids this stuff. And when we talk about the lizard legacy, we don't talk about sex. We talk about just safety and survival and sustenance and stuff like that. But you know when you're stressed out and you just find yourself going to the freezer and opening up the freezer, taking out the ice cream, and not even bothering to get a bowl, right? That's the lizard legacy, right? Okay? It says food, right? Well, we did a program, and this woman taught her class, her Sunday school class, and her son is in first grade. And this kid came home from first grade and said, Mommy, there was a fire drill. And the mother said, really? Tell me about it. And the kid says, oh, I was so scared. The bells were clanging, and I went outside. We were walking out to the street. He said, and I was telling myself, monkey mind, calm down. Lizard legacy, you're not hungry. Now, is that amazing for a first grader? Talk about a witness. See, evolutionary psychology encourages human compassion and cooperation precisely because it explores what we all have in common, human universals. I mentioned also that there's a thing called mismatch theory, that is, our instincts are not matched for the world that we live in. right? Our instincts are matched for a different world, right? I mean, you would not expect a wolf or a giraffe or an elephant to go counter to its instincts very easily, would you? Yet we're expected to go counter to our instincts every day. I mean, as a high testosterone alpha male type, my instincts are to mate it if it moves. And yet if I act on my instincts, I destroy my marriage, I destroy my mission, my life goes down the tubes. So the question is, how can I be in integrity, impeccable integrity, given my instincts? How can my instincts serve my life purpose, my higher purpose? This is where this perspective can be totally life-changing. And young people get it. I think many of us liberals, and I'm assuming most of this audience is liberal, many people in the liberal tradition come to me and say, you know, I raised my kid a good, you know, inclusive liberal, and now she's a fundamentalist, or he's a fundamentalist. What happened? Well, who's talking about our unchosen nature other than the conservatives? And they're using their night language to talk about it, but finally we have a science-based way of talking about this that doesn't make the conservatives wrong. In fact, my view is that until we who embrace evolution can communicate it in a way that conservative religious believers feel in their guts is holy or sacred or meaningful, then they should continue to reject evolution. In my opinion, the onus of responsibility is on those of us who do embrace evolution to find ever more holy or sacred or meaningful ways of communicating it. And until we're successful in that, conservatives should continue to reject evolution. In fact, I'll tell you, the first time that I ever got a chance to speak to an entirely young Earth creationist group, it was an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship group up in Canada. And I asked the group at the start, I said, how many of you do not accept an evolutionary worldview? Virtually everybody raised their hand. I thought I asked the question wrong. I rephrased it. Same thing, right? And I thought to myself, this is going to be an interesting evening. I stopped and I said, those of you who reject evolution, you're absolutely right to have rejected evolution. I was silent. I said, because the only version of evolution that most of us have ever been exposed to is a chance, meaningless, purposeless, mechanistic, cruel, godless, directionless process. And that's not what I'm talking about. I was silent. I said, now if you'll allow me to, not because I'm trying to convert you or convince you, it's okay with me if you differ, but if you're open to it, I would love to share with you why I am passionately excited about a God-glorifying, Christ-edifying, Scripture-honoring way of thinking about evolution. And I was silent for 10 seconds. And I could literally feel the whole room open up. They were going to let me speak. And I had some of the same young, angry, testosterone-filled guys, 18 to 20-year-old guys that were ready. They were loaded for bear. They were ready to blow my butt away. One guy had his King James Bible and his Strong's Concordance laid out on the desk. And yet at the end of my program, the same guy came up to me at the end and he gave me a bear hug and said, now you haven't converted me, but I'm not threatened by your perspective. There were a few things I really like. That's a huge move in 2 hours. Somebody sent us this cartoon. I love it. The universe becomes self-conscious. Eat, survive, reproduce, eat, survive, reproduce, eat, survive, reproduce, eat, survive, reproduce. What's it all about? And we wonder why we occasionally struggle with issues related to food safety and sex. I mean, come on. Interpreting the insights of evolutionary psychology and evolutionary brain science religiously, we vitalize our appreciation of doctrines such as the fall and original sin. Now we can comprehend in a realistic way why it is that we and our loved ones struggle with unwanted habits and why our most important relationships can be so challenging. This is not so much a picture of human beings looking at the earth. I mean, it's one way of talking about it. But from a deep time perspective, a more accurate way of talking about this is one of the first times that Earth became complex enough that a piece of itself could get off of itself and look back at itself. This is Earth looking in the mirror. It matters what we think about evolution. Trying to understand reality without an evolutionary worldview is like trying to understand infection without microscopes or the structure of the universe without telescopes. It's not merely difficult, it's impossible. Until we recognize billions of years, not just thousands of years, of grace and guidance, We will remain stuck with abstract and trivial concepts of God, morally confusing and divisive notions of Scripture, and unnatural and competitive understandings of religion. God didn't stop revealing truth vital to human well-being back when people believed the world was flat and religious insights were recorded on animal skins. God is still communicating faithfully today, publicly, through the worldwide self-correcting scientific enterprise. Facts are God's native tongue. When people get the distinction between private and public revelation and day and night language, and that God can be nothing less than a sacred name or a proper name for ultimate reality, this becomes obvious. Facts is God's native tongue. I mean, who of us would let a first-century dentist fill our children's teeth? Yet so many of us, or so many of our neighbors, let first-century theologians fill our children's minds every day. It's because we haven't had these kinds of distinctions. This isn't in any way putting down traditional scriptures, but it's also holding up science as revelatory. Until we see the entire history of the universe as scripture and create laws and incentives that align the self-interests of individuals, corporations, and nations with the well-being of the body of life as a whole, we will continue to toxify the air, water, and soil, drive other species to extinction, and be hounded by religious, political, social, and economic crises. I cannot even begin to say how crucial this is. See, here's this directionality to evolution, this emergent complexity, greater interdependence, and greater cooperation at larger and wider scale. And this way of talking about evolutionary directionality, even Richard Dawkins goes with. Most of the scientists of the world have no problem whatsoever. It's obvious. There's many ways of talking about evolutionary directionality that are not accurate scientifically. I'm using it in a very specific sense. So both in the pre-human world and in the human world, we keep finding ways over time to cooperate at larger and wider scale and thus enter greater complexity at larger and wider scale. And what this means is aligning, each level is able to do this by aligning the natural self-interest of the parts with the well-being of the whole that the parts are part of. In fact, that's what global governance and biocracy really mean, is that where we align our laws, medicines, basically, where we create an economic and governmental system so that individuals, corporations, and nation states that do well to the larger planetary good benefit, and the more good they do, the more they benefit. So they're incentivized to do as much good as possible. And individuals, corporations, and nation states that disregard or harm the common good are taxed or penalized, or there's moral strictures. So that it's in their self-interest to do the right, just, ecological thing, and it's also in their self-interest to not do the unjust, unecological thing. That's the primary thing, this aligning of the self-interest of the parts and the well-being of the whole. And we get this not from any text written 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. It couldn't have been revealed then. We get it through the entire history of the universe understood as Scripture. In an election year, we cannot trust our future to anyone who believes the world is but a few thousand years old and who interprets ancient apocalyptic writings as revealing God's perfect will. With global warming and global warring on the horizon, the time has come for down-to-earth leaders with heavenly aspirations that include everyone, everywhere. Until we grasp that death plays a vital and necessary role in an evolving cosmos, medical technologies will continue to prolong physical and emotional suffering. Medical choices will continue to provoke family discord. And the medical industry will continue to underwrite the widening gap between the rich and the poor. Connie, my wife, does an hour and 15-minute program on this DVD set called, this is a total of 4 hours, but one of the programs is called Death Through Deep Time Eyes, where she goes through and shows how in all the different sciences, we find death is not only natural and generative, that it's creative, but we couldn't have the universe like ours without it. If it weren't for the death of stars, there could be no planets, there could be no life. In fact, okay. What Connie does in an hour and 15 minutes, we're going to sum up in 3 minutes. Okay? It's a litany, right? And now I need help on this. Men in white, women in yellow. Men, without the death of stars, there would be no planets and no life.
Without the death of creatures, there would be no evolution.
Without the death of elders, there would be no room for children.
Without the death of fetal cells, there would all be spheres.
Without the death of plants and animals, there would be no food.
Without the death of old ways of thinking, there would be no room for the new.
Without death, there would be no ancestors.
Without death, time would not be precious.
What then are the gifts of death? The gifts of death are Mars and Mercury, Saturn and Earth.
The gifts of death are the atoms of stardust within our bodies.
The gifts of death are the splendors of shape and form and color.
The gifts of death are diversity, the immense journey of life.
The gifts of death are food, the sustenance of life.
The gifts of death are seeing, hearing, feeling, deeply feeling.
The gifts of death are the urgency to act, the desire to fully be and become.
The gifts of death are joy and sorrow, laughter and tears.
The gifts of death are lives that are fully and exuberantly lived, then graciously and gratefully given up, for now and forevermore.
Amen. And again, whether we use day or night language to talk about this, we can speak about it in day language as death is natural and generative at all levels of reality. Or we can use night language and say death is no less sacred than life. Or a Christian night language way of saying it, Good Fridays are consistently followed by Easter Sundays. Until churches in America preach evolution enthusiastically, sacredly, in ways that expand and enrich faith, the battle over the teaching of evolutionary science in public schools will never end. These are not the end times for humanity, they are just the beginning. We know this from the fossil record and from careful observation of the cosmos. Studying evolution is like following cosmic breadcrumbs home. Dinosaur bones and prehistoric artifacts, Hubble space photos and DNA are here to teach us faith, not test it. And then finally, until we learn to see through sacred deep time eyes, atheists and fundamentalists will continue to blame each other for the world's ills, liberals and conservatives will keep trashing one another, and collectively we will fail to see that enormous global challenges are divine evolutionary drivers guiding us to greatness. Let me say something about this last one, because it was a question at the beginning related to this. This is my cosmic rosary, okay? I grew up Catholic. You can't get the Catholic out of me, right? Okay. I've got 270 of the major transformational moments in the history of the universe represented in beads. Each bead signifies some significant event in the universe story. Don't worry, I'm not going to do it, but I could tell the entire universe story in beads, right? One of the things that we realize when we look at the whole history of life, the universe is not just a friendly, happy, put on a smile, is a nice day, it's all wonderful kind of place. There's chaos and destruction and breakdown and violence and extinctions. In fact, you can't have a universe without this destructive, chaotic part. And yet one of the interesting things is, if you got the whole thing represented visually like I do, is that on the other side of all the major catastrophes, on the other side of every major extinction in Earth's history, with no exception, is this unleashing of huge creativity, new possibilities, new opportunities, and in many cases couldn't have even been there without it. It's almost like God, or the goddess, or Allah, or whatever your name for this sacred evolutionary process. It's almost like this process delights in taking bad news and turning it into new creative possibilities. In fact, let me say it as strongly as I possibly can. The primary driver of evolutionary creativity and transformation, like the main thing, the number one thing that for billions of years has driven and catalyzed the process of evolutionary creativity and transformation, is chaos, breakdowns, and bad news. Now, I don't know about you, but in the current political situation, that gives me a little bit of hope. And think about your own life. I mean, I can't speak for you, but the most difficult, challenging, painful times in my life, the kind of times I would not want to have to relive, have also unquestionably been the most important growing times. And that's true for most people. No matter what our attempts to inform, it is our ability to inspire that will turn the tides. I'll close with this quote, and then I'll take a few minutes and describe some of the books and tapes that we have. Tell me a creation story more wondrous than that of a living cell forged from the residue of an exploded star. Tell me a story of transformation more magical than that of a fish hauling out onto land and becoming amphibian, or that of a reptile taking to the air and becoming bird, or that of a mammal slipping back into the sea and becoming whale. Surely, this science-based culture of all cultures can find meaning and cause for celebration in its very own cosmic creation story. Do you know where I found this quote? This was on the cover of the UU World, which is the membership magazine, the national membership magazine for the Unitarian Universalist Association. Somebody 10 years ago gave me a copy of this, and I read the article, and I was so blown out of the water and impressed by this quote, I decided I'd track down and marry the author. And that's a true story, folks. This is my wife's book that was featured in that article, Green Space, Green Time, The Way of Science, or you could say the spirituality of science. It's basically how the evolutionary sciences and the ecological sciences can enrich your spirituality, your communion with the whole of reality. It's like a natural theology or natural spirituality. In fact, it's one of the primary books in what's called religious naturalism. If you want to explore this kind of a sacred way of thinking about evolution more deeply, and especially if you want to share this perspective with others for free, what we most recommend are our DVDs. And the reason we say for free, we say burn as many copies of these as you want for others for free. We not only give you the rights, we make it easy for you to do this. Up on our website, we have the covers. So if you have a color printer, you can print off the covers. You can go to Office Depot or Staples or one of these places and get blank DVDs very inexpensively. Or you can take these to Kinko's and let them do it. In fact, I know of a minister of a large church in the Midwest who took these 3 and made 35 copies of them at Kinko's for his leadership of his church. Each of these is 4 hours of our best programs. This one here, the first 2 hours, is based on some of the things I talked about tonight and a lot of things in my book, Thank God for Evolution. When I sent out my book to various leading scientists and theologians, the first Nobel Prize winner that wrote an endorsement was this one, Lee Hartwell. He said, "At last, someone who understands that all of reality is sacred and science is our method of comprehending it." I was in tears when I got his email. But I cover the holy trajectory of evolution, this nested emergence, the purpose. What's the role of the human in the universe process? What's our purpose as a species? This perspective gives us a clear sense of that. God and reality, public and private revelation, day and night language, the whole difference between religious believing and religious knowing, creatheism or creatheism, facts as God's native tongue, why evolutionary integrity is our only way to salvation. In fact, when I speak to Christians, why I say Christ-like evolutionary integrity, because however you interpret the stories of Jesus the Christ in the New Testament, or what Christians call the New Testament, the early Christian scriptures, whether you interpret those stories as completely, totally, historically factual in every detail, or completely fictional, completely mythic in every detail, it doesn't, or anything in between, it doesn't matter. If you take a straightforward reading of those stories, the figure of Jesus the Christ is the embodiment of what I call the DNA of evolutionary integrity. Trust, authenticity, responsibility, and service. And those 4 are at the heart of the 12-step program. They're at the heart of virtually every religious tradition. And it's not a surprise. That's how we get freedom around our unchosen nature. In fact, it's the only way. If you think you can have lasting freedom, and if you think you can know the heavenly joy that passes all understanding, not having trust or faith or humility, authenticity, responsibility, and service, you're kidding yourself. And then finally, how this perspective is transforming people's lives and relationships. The second 2 hours of this DVD set I did with high school girls at a Catholic Girls Academy, and I let their questions guide. So they asked, this is by far the best program that I have for conservative Christians. It's the best bridge to conservative Christianity, because I let their questions guide me and through the entire program. And it's unlike any other program that I've ever done. All of that's on this 4-hour DVD set. It's a companion to my book, and we have a 55-page study guide on the website that you can use this and my book for like a group study. This is mostly Connie. This is 4 hours, but it's 3 hours and 10 minutes of Connie and 50 minutes of me. It has 2 of my most popular sermons that I do in liberal contexts. The Great Story, Bridging Diversity, Inspiring Celebration, Empowering Great Work, and Can the Universe Be Trusted? And then the rest of this DVD set is Connie. Connie does a 50-minute program called Coming Home to North America. It's how to become native to this continent. See, being a Native American isn't just having Native American blood, it's a mind and heart set. So Connie tells the story of what happened with how the Bear Paw Seaway dried up 62 million years ago. The Colorado Rockies began rising 62 million years ago, and that's what dried up the Bear Paw Seaway. See, this is all land. All this is land. This is water here. In fact, South America is completely isolated from anywhere else in the world. So only 3 million years ago did the Isthmus of Panama arise, which is what linked up north and south. And all the big mammals, not all of them, but most of the big mammals from North America just went south and just devastated, just demolished all the South American mammals. Just overpowered them. Wiped them out. The idea that everything else lives in harmony and we humans are the only ones that do damage is just not true from an evolutionary perspective. Connie tells the story of which animals came over from Asia 55 million years ago, 17 million years ago, 5 million years ago. These are the natives to North America. Did you know that camels are native to North America? If anything is native to North America, camels are. They're here for 55 million years. The pronghorn antelope, right? You know, Wyoming, you don't have pronghorn around here, do you? Do you really? That's great. The pronghorn can run 65 miles an hour. But wait a second. The fastest predator in North America is the wolf. The wolf can only run 40 miles an hour. What's a pronghorn running from? It's running from its partner of 15 million years, the American cheetah, the only genus of cat native to North America. It's a fascinating story, and Connie tells it brilliantly. Connie does an hour and 10-minute program for Montessori teachers, teaching them how to teach kids this whole notion that we are made of stardust, kids of all ages, teenagers as well. Which kinds of stars create which kinds of atoms? Our star, our sun, is hydrogen becoming helium. Inside red giant stars, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen are formed. And then inside blue-white stars that have a supernova explosion, all these other elements are formed. And then in my opinion, this is Connie's best program of all, and this is worth the price of this DVD in itself. In fact, everything that we sell with a complete, we're totally committed that you are totally pleased with what you get. So anything if you get from us, if it's not at least an 8 on a scale of 0 to 10, like if you're not totally satisfied, just send me an email. My email is michael@thegreatstory.org. We'll refund your money. I've made this promise for 6 years. 3 times have I ever had to return anything. And this is, in my opinion, Connie's best program of all. Because she takes a look at the major sciences, paleontology, evolution and biology, embryology, cell biology and ecology, astronomy and astrophysics, geology and geography and math, and shows some of the major scientific discoveries in each of these areas that have helped us come to an understanding, like we saw before, that death is not only natural and generative, but it's no less sacred than life. And I promise you, I guarantee, no matter what your views about what happens on the other side of death, if anything, just understanding this will build trust. It builds faith. It allows us to trust the process for ourselves and in our loved ones. I mean, any supposed faith in God that doesn't include trusting that whatever happens on the other side of death is just fine is no faith at all. Fear of a hellish, terrifying after-death scenario or hope of a blissful, heavenly after-death scenario are just that, fear or hope. Not faith, not trust. All of that's on this 4-hour DVD set. As I said, it's mostly Connie. Both of these there's a 50% overlap. They're each 4 hours, but the first 2 hours of this and the second 2 hours of this are the same program delivered to different audiences. It was the main program that I delivered for almost 3 years, called Beyond Sustainability, an inspiring vision of the next 250 years. And the reason that I picked 250 years is because if you compress the whole history of the universe into 100 years, like if you make 14 billion years equals 100 years, every minute on the cosmic century timeline is 250 years. So think about it. If we've got 100 years of trends and patterns and tendencies to study and to observe and learn from, do you think there's a few things that we might be able to say with some degree of certainty about what the next minute might be like? Well, I'd hope, otherwise we're in deep trouble. So if this is the beginning of the universe, and this is right now, and the last 10 years, we blow out here, right? At that time scale, every minute is 250 years. So I spent about a half hour on this chart. And then I go back and I spend about an hour. There's a lot more information in terms of here, and this is Ken Wilber's 4-quadrant model. So this is spiral dynamics. So I talk about this in great detail. I spent about an hour on these two charts. It's a very, very hopeful perspective, especially for people involved in peace and justice issues. Many people tell me that this is the single most inspiring and hopeful chart I've used in the last 6 years. It compares how the mechanistic paradigm, that is how the idea that nature was like a complex clock, came into being. It was introduced in 1543. It went through 4 major phase changes before it became the dominant paradigm during this 40-year period here, between 1760 and 1800. And this sacred, nested, creative, this organic understanding is going through exactly the same process. And if the pattern repeats, which there's no guarantee that it will, but it seems to be every evidence that it does, that it is, in the next 40 to 60 years, we are likely to see the kind of major changes that we saw during this 40-year period. I believe in the next 50 years, we will see a global democratic revolution, an environmental revolution, and what I call a biomimicry revolution. That is where we mimic biology rather than mimicking machines, and our redesign of law, medicine, politics, economics, education. And I believe we will see a worldwide spiritual revival as all the religious traditions of the world not only tolerate, but wholeheartedly embrace an evolutionary ecological worldview. Finally, the major challenges. Again, we're only talking the next cosmic minute here, right? The next minute on the cosmic century timeline. What are the major challenges that we're going to have to deal with? These aren't the things that we might have to deal with, folks. We're going to have to deal with this stuff. And then what are the things that we may or may not have to deal with? But by God, if we have to deal with any of these things, they're going to be huge. This is the scary stuff. But I don't leave people here. We take a square look at the bad news because we're not going to have authentic hope if we're in denial. So we take a square look at the bad news, but I don't leave people there. I say, okay, given this, what are the long-term and the short-term positive trends that we can count on continuing? And this first one, the fact that bad news, chaos, and breakdowns catalyze creativity and transformation, helps us look at the other stuff through a different set of lenses. And then finally, what's the likely good news? I'm not talking about crossing our fingers and toes and saying, oh, please, 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 please. You know, Jesus, the cosmic janitor, come and rescue us from the mess we've made. I'm talking about the likely good news in the next 250 years. And this is very inspiring. Both of these charts are very, very inspiring. And all of that's on both of these DVDs. Now, what's unique to this one, what I do for the other 2 hours on this one, is I go into what are the 4 great gifts, how this perspective reconciles science and religion, how it transforms our view of chaos and bad news, how it broadens our circles of care, compassion, cooperation, and commitment, and how it evokes inspiring, empowering visions of the future. What's unique to this one is where I get into all the Christian stuff. And if you have any Christians in your life, I highly recommend this because this is by far, I go into more depth in terms of how the difference between flat earth Christianity and evolutionary Christianity. If you get one of these, it's $30, and if you get two or more of these, they're $25 each. So if you get 2, it's $50, 3, $75, and if you get all 4 of them, it's $100. And if you're just flat broke, right, you just lost your job or whatever, you just don't have any money, but you really want one of these and you'll make copies for others, just pay whatever you can. We just want to get the word out. Could you please shut off at least one set of these lights? Yeah, keep going. No, oh, that's great. Oh, that's great. Okay. I wanted to share this because these guys invited me to the Library of Congress. The guy on the left, now mind you, I'm almost 6'1", okay? These guys are tall. The guy on the left is John Mather. He's, up until just a couple weeks ago, he was NASA's chief scientist. He's the 2006 Nobel Prize winner in physics. The guy on the right is Craig Mello. He's the 2006 Nobel Prize winner in medicine and physiology. They both wrote endorsements for my book, and that's why they invited me to the Library of Congress. John Mather said, "The universe took 13.7 billion years to produce this amazing book. I heartily recommend it." Folks, as an author, it doesn't get better than that. Craig Mello said, "The science versus religion debate is over. A must-reading for all, including scientists." Now, I don't know if this is going to get me on Oprah or not, but I figure it can't hurt. And you know when you go to a movie and you see, like, before the feature film, you see like a trailer where it has, like, you know, a minute to a minute and a half, maybe 2-minute introduction to other movies? We created a book trailer for my book, and I wanted to share this with you. Needless to say, we were pretty pleased. Okay, you can bring the lights back up, thanks. I'd like to close with a song. And, oh, by the way, all the copies of my book that are back there are signed, but if you want me to personalize it for you, I'm happy to do that. But this song, Peter Mayer Sings the Great Story is the CD that we have of his music. And this song is one of my absolute favorites. It's called Everything is Holy Now. And once you get the tune, which you will pretty quickly, please help me sing along.
When I was a boy each week, on Sunday we would go to church and pay attention to the priest. He would read the holy word and consecrate the holy bread, and everyone would kneel and bow. Today the only difference is everything is holy now. Everything is holy now. And when I was in Sunday school, we would learn about the time Moses split the sea in two, and Jesus made the water wine. And I remember feeling sad. Still, now I can't keep track, 'cause everything's a miracle. Everything's a miracle. Wine from water is not so small, but an even better magic trick. Hear it all. So
Please help me sing along.
Water was rare at best. It barely wet my fingertips. But now I have to hold my breath like I'm swimming in a sea of it. It used to be a world half there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-down. But I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now. Read a questioning child's face. Say it's not a testament. That'd be very hard to say. See another new morning come. Say it's not a sacrament. I tell you that it can't be done. This morning outside I stood, I saw a little red-winged bird shining like a burning bush and singing like a scripture verse. It made me want to bow my head. I remember when church let out, how things have changed since then. Everything is holy now. It used to be a world half there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-down. But I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now.
Isn't that great? I'd like to close with a quote. And this quote will give you a sense of why Connie and I have lived on the road for 6 years and why we anticipate probably living on the road the rest of our lives. And it's from Brian Swim. He's the physicist that I've quoted a couple times earlier. And it goes like this. I am convinced that the story of the universe that's come out of 3 centuries of modern scientific work will be recognized as a supreme human achievement, the scientific enterprise's central gift to humanity. I am convinced, he says, that the story of the universe that's come out of 3 centuries of modern scientific work will be recognized as a supreme human achievement, the scientific enterprise's central gift to humanity. For the first time in human history, we finally have a creation story that's not tied to one cultural tradition, nor to a political ideology, but instead gathers every human group into its meanings. We are in the midst of a revelatory experience of the universe that must be compared in its magnitude with those of the great religious revelations. And we need only wander about telling this great story to ignite a transformation of humanity. Connie and I have taken that last sentence very literally. Thank you.